We have a packed agenda, so I'm going to start right on the button at 4 without waiting for our customary 4 to 5 minute um, uh, additional available time. So good afternoon, and thank you everyone for joining us. My name is Henry Schilling. I'm a FIAZI board member, and on behalf of the entire FIAZI board, I'd like to welcome you to this afternoon session that has been set aside for presentations by the winner and runners-up to our fifth annual sustainable finance research competition in fixed income. Before I turn this over to our presenters, I'd like to just share a few comments regarding the competition. I had agreed originally to limit my remarks to about 3 minutes, but I came to the conclusion that I couldn't really say very much in 3 minutes, so this may run a minute or so longer. Hopefully you'll bear with me. So this session will wrap up our fifth annual research competition. And the research competition, which is jointly sponsored by FIAZI and the Fordham University Gabelli School of Business, invites undergraduate, graduate, and postgraduate students in the US and overseas to submit their ongoing original research on the topic of investing and innovations in sustainable finance and fixed income or related markets. The primary purpose of the competition is to raise awareness and highlight the importance of integrating financially relevant and material, environmental, social, and governance-based factors into investment decisions in the fixed income markets as a research area, and also to address challenges and opportunities associated with the deployment of new technologies and solutions to solve sustainability-related business challenges. And finally, to gain more visibility for and encourage conversations among students, academics, practitioners, as well as other stakeholders. This year, we fielded 21 research papers that were reviewed by a committee consisting of representatives from the Gabelli School of Business, FIAZI, as well as the private sector. And I should mention the names of the committee members, starting with the Fordham team, Professor An Yan, who is the Robert Bentheim Chair Professor in Economics and Financial Policy, Professor of Finance and Area Chair, Finance and Business Economics, and co-director of the Center for Research in Contemporary Finance. Second is Professor Srish Chatterjee, Gabelli's Chair in Global Security Analysis, Finance and Business Economics. You will meet both of these individuals in a few minutes. And also John Finnerty, who is Professor of Finance of Business Economics, and he also happens to be a Hall of Fame, FIAZI Hall of Fame member. On the FIAZI side, the committee members included Mark Howard, who is the Managing Director and Senior Multi-Asset Specialist at BNP Paribas, Maria Rosa Verdi, Senior Vice President and Group Credit Officer for the Americas at Moody's Ratings. And finally, myself, on the FIAZI side, I'm the Director of Research, Sustainable Research and Analysis, LLC. And then we had two industry representatives. Last but not least, Amy Levine, who is the Director of ESG at Shankman Capital Management, and Stephen Libertor, Senior Managing Director, Head of ESG Impact Global Fixed Income at Nuveen, a TIAA company. He's the manager of the largest focused sustainable fixed income fund in the US. The competition winners were announced at our Sustainable Finance and Fixed Income Conference that was held on April 9th, and the winners and runner-ups received financial stipends, and the authors were invited back to present their research findings, which is why we're here today. And with that, I'm going to turn the screen over to Srish to introduce the first presenter. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Henry. And thank you, all the participants. And thanks to everyone in the audience for joining us today in this very important set of presentations. And Henry, special thanks to you for your leadership, and special thanks to Lauren for all her support, and of course to all the members from the FIASI team who helped us, successfully complete the 5th year of this competition. In the interest of time, let me introduce to our audience our first speaker, who won the top prize, as Henry already mentioned. Our first speaker will be Huiyao Chen, soon to become Dr. Huiyao Chen. He's going to receive his Ph.D. in finance from the Wharton School very soon. And he's going to present his paper with the title, The Paradox of ESG Investing, Greenwashing versus Real Impact. He will speak for about 20 minutes, at the end of which we'll have 10 minutes of Q&A. And those of us in the audience, please submit your questions in the Q&A part at the bottom of your screen. And so with that, I will hand it over to Huiyao. Please let me know if you can share your screen, Huiyao, and let's get started.
Sure. Thank you. Yeah, let me first share my screen. So yeah, I'm very honored to receive this award, and yeah, thank you very much for inviting me. And I will present my paper, "The Paradox of ESG Investing: Greenwashing versus Real Impact." So this is a theoretical paper, and I will start with a very brief motivation, basically why this topic is important and why we need a model in this specific question. So in recent years, there has been a prominent change in the financial market. Basically, investors nowadays increasingly care about ESG performance of firms. Basically, they not only care about the profits, they also care about like the carbon emissions produced in firms' operations. But following these trends, there have been some unexpected consequences. Greenwashing also becomes more prevalent nowadays. Specifically, firms may only make green claims to cater to or mislead investors, but they do not make any real green efforts. There are a lot of real-world cases of greenwashing, like those fossil fuel companies. They may claim to make some green transitions, which turns out to be just cheap talk after investigation. And on the other hand, I want to highlight that people and investors, they really care about real impact of ESG investing. Namely, they care about whether their capital really push firms to go greener and incentivize more ESG practices. But when we look into empirical evidence, there is actually a lot of debate over this question. Does ESG investing really push firms to go greener? So what does this paper do? In this paper, I basically provide a theoretical framework to analyze this question. When investors, they care more about ESG, how would the firms respond and adjust their ESG-related activities? And before I go into the main results, the main contribution, I want to highlight two key model features that contribute to these results. So the first is that in the model, I highlight the information frictions in the ESG space. Basically, there are a lot of manipulation and greenwashing activities going on. So I'm going to jointly analyze greenwashing and the real green investment in the model. And as a second feature, I want to highlight the two dimensions of firms' fundamentals in the model, which differs in their information structure. So the first dimension is the traditional financial performance, which usually have objective realizations. So we can think of like this example when firms talk about cash flows. There are usually like verifiable evidence in their daily operations, and it's easy to verify such claims, whether it's true or not. But when it turns to ESG performance, it's usually subject to a lot of manipulation. When, for example, when firms talk about their scope 3 emissions, they would set a very long-term goal, and they want to reduce like emissions in 20 years, for example. But this relies highly on firms' internal estimation, and it's very hard for investors to monitor this progress. So this feature contributes to the main result of the paper. So I want to highlight 2 points out from the model. At the first point, based on these main model features, I'm able to derive predictions very different from existing models, and I call this result the paradox of ESG investing. Basically, the model shows that under some conditions, when investors have stronger ESG preference, firms may respond with even less real green investment. And the reason is the endogenous rise of greenwashing, and I will explain in more detail later. And I want to highlight that this result actually provide us the theoretical benchmark to do more empirical tests in the future, because ex ante and a lot of existing papers tell us that we should expect more green activities following growth in ESG investing. But my model actually proposed this surprising result. Basically, under some conditions, we may expect the positive result, but under some conditions, we should expect no result or even negative results. And then I'm able to identify the key conditions for this surprising result and link the real impact of ESG investing to the market environment, like the information environment. So I will show you that when the ESG outcome is more manipulable, there is more likely to be this negative results. And this is the novel empirical and policy implications I want to highlight. So I think that's a very quick overview about the main results. And next, I will go into a little bit of detail. I will very briefly talk about the model, and then I can illustrate the intuition why the surprising results can arise in a very simple model. So the model has 3 stages: real investment, information disclosure, and trading. Let me start with the first stage. So at the first stage, the firm gets either a green or brown investment opportunity. So the firm basically make some real investment to which affect their actual performance. If the firm invests in green, then it becomes a green firm. So it reduces carbon emission, which increases its ESG performance. But there is some financial cost related to this green investment. And also the firm might have brown opportunity and it invests in brown. Then in this case, it boosts its profits, so the financial performance increase, but it may increase its carbon emissions, so the ESG performance could decrease. So this basically pins down the key trade-off between green and brown investment. It differs in ESG and financial performance. So after this stage, we may get some green firm, some brown firm. They differ in their actual investment strategy, actual types. And then we have the key step in the model, actually, the information disclosure stage. So in this stage, there are 2 signals disclosed publicly. The first signal is the financial signal. So as I introduced before, the financial information in the market, like the information that the disclosure about cash flow, is usually objective and verifiable by investors. But the second signal, the ESG signal, like the disclosure about long-term scope 3 emissions, is usually subject to manipulation, and it's very hard to verify such claims. So in this case, I model it as the information manipulation. Basically, if the firm is a green firm, meaning that it invests in green in the first stage, then it always generates a green signal. But if the firm is a brown firm, then it can engage in greenwashing. As it chooses a higher level of greenwashing, then it's more likely to send a green signal to investors. Basically, the brown firm, they pay some cost to greenwash, and they can mimic those green firms. It models the information in the market and might make investors confused about those green claims. So then we have the last stage, the trading stage. There are a lot of investors with ESG preference, and they trade and determine the market price of the firm. So we can think of the firm's asset as either stocks or some bonds, but and the price of these assets has two components here. The first component is the ESG component, because people, the investors, they care about ESG performance of firms. And the second component here is the traditional financial component, which captures the financial value of the firm. And I think the key in this model is that the ESG component here has two components. The first is the beta here, which measures the investors' ESG preference in the market. So basically, when investors have stronger ESG preference, there should be a higher green premium in those green assets. This is intuitive ex ante, I think. And the second component is the new component in my model. So basically, there might be some greenwashing in the market, and the information could be is not like fully reliable. So when investors observe green signals, they might be skeptical about the reliability of this green signal. Basically, when they observe the firm claim to be green, it could come from some green firm, actual green firm. Also, it could come from a greenwashing firm. So because of this skepticism about the green claims, investors are willing to pay less for those firms claim to be green, because they are not sure whether the firm is actually doing green or just greenwash. So this is the counterforce, because on the one hand, we have stronger ESG preference, which increase green premium. But on the other hand, investor could be skeptical about green claims, which decrease the green premium because they are less willing to pay for green assets as there are more greenwashing. And I think this is actually the key tension in the model. Basically, investors, they have ESG preference and they determine the stock price. And the firm managers, they care about the stock price and they want to do something to satisfy those investors and increase the price of their firm. And this is the key interaction between investors and managers in the model. So based on this setup, I want to show you the key result of the paper. So I'm showing you two figures here. The left figure is the level of greenwashing. So basically, the x-axis is beta invest, which measures the investors' ESG preference in the market, and the y-axis on the left figure is the level of greenwashing. So the first result is that when investors, they care more about ESG, then there is a higher level of greenwashing in this market. I think this is intuitive because brown firms, they have stronger incentives to greenwash and to cater to those investors, and people care more about ESG. And then we have the right figure, which shows the key result of the paper. So I'm showing you three different equilibrium here. Again, x-axis is beta, investors' ESG preference, and the blue line here is the reward for green investment, and we can see its hump shift is not strictly increasing in investors' ESG preference. And there are three different regions. The left region is marked brown, the right region is marked brown, and the intermediate region is marked green. So let me introduce them one by one. So this figure actually captures firms' real green investment depending on investors' ESG preference, and there can be three different equilibrium. So the first equilibrium, which is the left region here, it means that when investors have very weak ESG preference, firms basically have no incentive to do any green projects. So I think this equilibrium is the simplest one, because in a world where no one cares about ESG and no firms would do ESG projects, do green projects. And then I want to show you the second result, which I think is surprising ex ante. So basically, in the very right region, we still get only brown investment, but the investors in this region actually have very strong ESG preference. And the reason is that, as I'm showing you on the left figure, the level of greenwashing is increasing with investors' ESG preference. So in this region, this means a very hot market about ESG assets. There is also a lot of greenwashing among those firms. So in this world, when investors observe green claims, observe those ESG information, they would be highly skeptical about the green claims because they know there must be a lot of greenwashing going on, and they basically lose confidence about the firm's green claims. So they have to discount those green assets because they do not want to pay a high premium for those greenwashing firms. And this force actually disincentivize the real green investment because real green firms, they lack the tools to signaling their actual effort to go green, and they actually do not get sufficient reward from those investors. So I think this is a different equilibrium because in this case, investors are very willing to pay for green assets, but they are not able to do so because of the information friction, because of a lot of misinformation on ESG side. So, and the last, I think I want to show you the last results. So only when investors have moderate ESG preference, basically in the intermediate region, we can possibly get the green investment. Basically, there is mild greenwashing, so it does not harm information quality too much, and still there is sufficient reward for real green investment. And only in this case, some firms, they are willing to go green to satisfy ESG investors. So I think this is a very brief introduction about the model, the main results of the model. And I want to summarize in one word. So basically, it tells us that without proper regulation of ESG information, growth in ESG investing can actually backfire because it induces too much greenwashing, which crowd out real green investment. So this is actually the key message of the paper. And then based on these results, so I'm able to talk about the conditions under which this surprising result can arise. So under some conditions, we should expect positive real effects, and under some conditions, we should expect negative real effects. And due to the time limitation, I think I'm only able to cover this the most important one, the ESG information manipulation cost. So again, on the left figure, I'm showing you the information distortion, which captures the level of greenwashing. So if we fix the investor's ESG preference, and when there is a lower level of manipulation cost, there is naturally a higher level of greenwashing. And on the right figure, again, this is the reward for green investment. It's harm-shaped, and if we fix investors' ESG preference, and if there is a lower manipulation cost due to the increasing greenwashing, there should be a lower reward for green investment. So it means that when if the ESG outcome is very susceptible to manipulation, then ESG investing should have weak or even negative real effects on those ESG outcomes. So we may expect some ESG outcome which is relatively easy to measure, then we may expect positive real effects on those ESG outcomes. But some ESG outcome which is very hard to verify, we may expect negative real effects when investors, they care more about those ESG outcomes. So I have some example here, like because in reality, ESG outcomes, they differ a lot actually in their manipulability. Like some ESG measurements, they have poor measurements, like Scope 3 emissions and the corporate inclusion. And some may have very long horizons, like those net zero commitments usually have like a 20 or 30 years horizons. So it's very hard to verify the claims. And in this case, if people care too much about those outcomes, firms may be more inclined to do greenwashing, which crowd out those real green firms. So I think that's the key message of the paper. And I want to, due to the time limitation, I want to quickly conclude here. So what does this paper do? The paper proposes a model, and in the model, we find the paradox of ESG investing. Under some conditions, when investors care more about ESG, firms may respond with even less real green investment. And the key channel is the endogenous rise of greenwashing. And based on this paradox, I'm able to tell under what conditions we should expect the ex-ante result, the positive real effects, and under what conditions we may expect the paradox, the negative surprising results. And this brings us novel empirical and policy implications. So basically, the model can provide a theoretical benchmark to guide future empirical tests. Basically, we may test under what conditions there is positive real effect and under what conditions we may get negative results. And at the last point, I think we exactly live in a world where people have rising ESG concerns, but the ESG information regulation is still on the way. There is a lot of revolution going on. And this is exactly where the model, the paradox matters. So that's all I have today, and thank you for listening, and I'm open to more discussions and more questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Huiyao. That was right on time. And on behalf of colleagues on my side, on our side, we want to congratulate you for putting together, addressing a very difficult question and putting together a theoretical model that can look into these questions. But of course, we also realize that in a model, you make stylized assumptions. And so
Yes.
you can expect that there will be some questions on some of those assumptions and also policy implications. So let me start out with some questions about the stylized assumptions, and then I have some policy questions coming from the audience. So in your model, you mentioned that brown firms can do a lot of greenwashing.
Yes.
But the question is whether what extent they can conceal their type, because investors, if they're very serious about ESG and green firms and green investing, they can possibly do some due diligence. And why is it that they cannot do that? So that's sort of one kind of question that may come up about your model.
Yes. So so I think that's like more motivated on the real world side, because I think there are a lot of real world cases on greenwashing. So usually what happens is that investors, they may like be skeptical about the firm might engage in greenwashing. I think a lot of cases on fossil fuel firms, and then they may file it to SEC, and there are some investigation on the regulator side. And then what happens is that the investigation usually lasts like several years, but it turns out like there is no like definite answer whether the firm is actually greenwashing or not. Usually there is a lot of kind of, as I highlighted before, those evidence on ESG, on greenwashing is usually very hard to verify. So I think that's the key obstacle. Like investors, of course, they want to do due diligence, but most of those ESG data come from firms inside like operation, from their internal estimation. And I think that's a key obstacle here. And it's not only investors, even those like data vendors, those experts on ESG information, like ESG rating agency, they can get a lot of disagreement over the firm's ESG performance. So I think that's why the ESG information is so like special, in the sense that it's very hard, very hard to verify those claims, even exposed.
I have two questions here related
Yes.
to this assumption side. Two important policy questions. So let me ask them one by one. The first one is from Arthine Kossi van Duin, if I'm saying the name correctly. And the question is, I'm curious to know if you also included ESG investing in water or just emissions. I wonder if the outcomes differ between the two offset modes. I think is kind of related to the earlier question about how much of it investors can figure out.
Yes, so I think the model generally applies to any ESG issues because the key here is that there is a trade-off between the you increase cash flow or you want to address those ESG issues. It can be air pollution, can be carbon emissions, or can be water pollutions. And the model is able to accommodate a different level of manipulation cost. If you, I think that's more like the empirical question. Basically, if you think the outcome has a high manipulation cost, then we should expect a positive real effects. And if you expect if you think the outcome has a low manipulation cost, then you should expect negative results as a paradox. So I think whether those outcomes is manipulable or not is more like a empirical question. And what the model can tell you is that if you think if you have have the manipulation cost in mind, whether it's high or low, then the model can tell you what real consequence we should expect. And I think that's the correct way to think about the model.
Would you agree that the greenhouse gas emissions are much, they're a credible measure and that is hard to manipulate compared to other, for example, water? So isn't it true that greenhouse gas is easier to figure out?
So first I want to claim I'm not a specialist in environmental or so from my talk with those experts, what I know is that these are not very simple whether to measure carbon emissions or measure the water pollution, because if you think about carbon emission, there are different scopes from scope 1, scope 2 to scope 3. So actually they differ in the ease of manipulation. Like scope 3, currently people have really limited data to measure scope 3, but people have really good data to measure scope 1 emissions. So in this sense, scope 1 emission is very hard to manipulate, but scope 3 emissions is easy to manipulate. And also when it comes to water, I think there is also different levels of water pollution and different outcomes to measure different measurements to capture those water pollution. So I think that's a more subtle question. It's not we should not put all water pollutions together and talk about this.
Fair enough. So that's an empirical question. Here is the second policy question, and this is from our own Andrew Schilling. Question is, to what extent do you think that your results lend support for greater use of green and social bonds where the proceeds are allocation to achieve positive environment and social outcomes? You can understand that.
Sorry, I didn't get this question. So can you say it again? Maybe clarify a little bit.
So let me just read part of the question. To what extent do you think that your results lend support for greater use of green and social bonds?
So yes, so I think my result, a very direct implication from my result is that if the firms when the firms issue green bonds, they should more contingent to the they should link the the ESG outcome more to those measurable outcomes the scope 1 emission, as I just mentioned. So it should be less linked to those manipulable outcomes like scope 3 emissions. So in that case, investors may get the real impact or get the good results they want. But otherwise, if the bonds is linked to manipulable outcomes, then we may have the paradox arise.
Let me get back to some other aspects of your model.
Yes.
Have you had a chance to think about how this model could be extended to a dynamic setting? Can the market learn over time? Can the investors learn over time where brown firms will not be able to play the game at the same level that they're playing in the stylized setting of the model?
So what you ask is basically like if the model is dynamic, then does the key result still exist or not? Is that correct?
Yes, I mean, what additional features would you include in the model to make it a dynamic model?
So yes, I think it's still, so now it's clearly it's not a dynamic model, and I think the key setup if we want to make it a dynamic is that how much information investors can learn at the end of the day. That this is there are like a full resolution of uncertainty. Like at the end of the day, investors observe the green outcomes, the ESG outcomes, or even at the end of the day, like it's very hard to verify those green claims. And when they observe those green claims, how much punishment can they give? Because like if they get the info, verify the result, like verify the net zero commitment after 10 years, is it's still possible to give the firm like some punishment to kind of to motivate those firms to do some good thing ex ante. So I think that's that would make the model more complicated if the setting is dynamic. But whether the main results still exist depend on the key setting, like whether the information is fully resolved in the long term.
We have just about 1 more minute, so let me see if I can squeeze in one more question about your paper. At the end of your paper, you talk about some policy implications, and among the policy implications, you talk about executive compensation. You didn't have a chance to, I think, elaborate on that in your presentation today, but would you like to say something along those lines? Because there has been a lot of literature on executive compensation and ESG.
Yes. So I think one key I think takeaway or policy implication from the model is that those manager compensation, it can be complementary to complementary to the market incentivization. Basically, if we add more direct incentivization in the manager's compensation, which, for example, those can be very long-term objective, which directly link the manager's long-term compensation to the ESG outcome, like in 10 years, then it could be effectively discipline their behavior and make the market incentivization more effective. So because the manager has less incentive to greenwash, and when investors, they invest in the green bond, they are less concerned about greenwashing, and they are more willing to pay a higher premium for those green assets. So then in this case, it makes the market incentive, the market tools more effective. So I think that's one policy implication.
All right, I think with that we have to probably close this session, this presentation, because of our time. We hit on the time. So Henry, back to you. Or should I hand it over to An?
Yeah, I think it's
Yes.
it's my turn right now.
All right, very good. I'll hand it over to An. And
Thank you, Suris.
presentation.
Thank you, Suris. Thank you, Huiyao, for the excellent presentation. We can see why you deserve the award, and congratulations again for winning the award. And the next, it's going to be my turn to moderate the 2 more presentations. And the first presentation, we're going to have Leonie Engelhardt to present. She is runner-up, lead author winner of our student research competition. And Leonie is a PhD candidate in finance at the Swiss Finance Institute at the University of Geneva, with a focus on sustainable finance. She's currently visiting Columbia University. And her paper, winning paper, is titled The Economics of Sustainability-Linked Bonds. The paper is co-authored with Tony Barada, Regina Gibson, and Philip Kruner, all from University of Geneva. So without further ado, I will just pass the podium to Leonie, and you have 10 minutes for your presentation. Then we're going to have 5 to 10 minutes for the Q&As. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much. Can everyone hear me well?
Yes, we can.
Okay, perfect. So yeah, hello. First of all, I want to thank the award committee for recognizing our work for this runner-up award. My name is Leonie Engelhardt. As mentioned, I'm a PhD student at University of Geneva and the Swiss Finance Institute. Normally when I present this paper, I actually have to convince my audience first that conducting research in ESG in fixed income is indeed very important, as this kind of research is still very much understudied and underdeveloped. But I guess today I have the unique privilege that my audience is already convinced that what we do is at least important. But still, today we are facing a huge finance gap to meet the set climate targets. And a lot of research and academics still focus on ESG in the secondary equity market. Although we should know that secondary equity markets are not really important when it comes to financing sustainable projects or projects in general. And that's why we think more focus should be put on researching bonds or corporate bonds as an important source for financing sustainable projects. And that's why in our paper, we decided to study a novel ESG-related fixed income instrument, the so-called sustainability-linked bonds, short SLBs. Most of you have already most likely heard of these new instruments. So if there's one key takeaway I want you to remember from my presentation today, then it's what SLBs really are, how they are different from green bonds, and how the more sophisticated coupon structure can potentially incentivize companies to achieve higher sustainability objectives. So what are sustainability-linked bonds? Sustainability-linked bonds are any type of bond instrument for which the financial and/or structural characteristics can vary depending on whether the issuer achieves a predefined sustainability or ESG objective. That's the definition at hand. But let's unwrap this definition in more detail. So as the name already mentions, sustainability-linked bonds are bonds where the coupon payment is linked to a sustainability target the company wants to achieve. So when issuing an SLB, the company first must define a predefined measurable target, so a measurable KPI, and also must define an achievement horizon, time horizon until when the company wants to achieve this target. And one very important difference from SLBs to green bonds is that these bonds come with a flexibility in the use of proceeds. So whereas with green bonds, money raised with green bonds, the money has to be channeled directly into a green project. The money raised with SLBs can actually be used for any general purpose in the company. And also, as the main name mentions, the green bond focuses on green project, and the sustainability-linked bond can cover different E, S, and G pillar objectives. To understand how the coupon payment is linked to the sustainability target in more detail, let's look at this payout profile of SLB. So what we should basically see is that there are two scenarios to be considered. So as mentioned before, when a company wants to issue a SLB, it first has to define a KPI, a measurable KPI target, and the time observation date when it wants to achieve the target. And once the SLB is then issued, it starts paying the normal coupon rate up to this point where the target is observed. If now the company achieves the target at observation date, nothing really happens because the bond just goes on paying the normal coupon rate until maturity and the face value is paid back. The more interesting scenario is the other scenario where the company basically fails to achieve the target as an observation date, and additional coupon payment, we call G here in red, is triggered. Then the company must not only pay the coupon, but also an additional penalty payment, G, on top of the coupon until the bond matures. All this information are put in the prospectus once the SLB is issued. So all this information is known beforehand. But obviously what is not known and not observable is the probability of the company achieving the target and therefore paying or not achieving the target and paying the penalty. Therefore, it's difficult to price this new type of product because the payment going to investor is not known upfront, and you cannot simply construct a year to maturity to price this bond. So what do we do in our paper? Our paper consists of a theory and an empirical part. And in the theoretical part, we develop a mispricing model to not only understand the incentive structure, but also the pricing of these bonds. And we propose a novel mispricing measure we call ML in order to define if a bond is fairly priced or not. We also derive some testable implications from our models we then test in the empirical part. So first of all, in the empirical part, based on our model, overpriced SLBs should underperform in the secondary bond market, so there should be negative bond returns. This is due to the fact that investors that invest in overpriced bonds should become aware of this and then try to sell off these overpriced bonds in the secondary bond market, and then evidenced by negative returns on the bond market. On the other hand, overpriced SLBs should be associated with an outperformance in the stock market, so positive stock returns for the issuing company. This is due to the fact that if the company can sell overpriced bonds, it basically managed to cash in more money than it needs to achieve the sustainability target. And this money is then directly channeled into the pockets of the shareholders. So there should be a wealth transfer from bondholders to shareholders. We also check if there's a relationship between the mispricing and the ESG performance of the company measured in ESG scores. And finally, we also see if there are real effects of issuing SLBs on the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions for the companies. To understand our mispricing measure better, let's recall these two scenarios in the payment structure of the bond. So basically, as mentioned before, we don't know the probability of achieving the target or not, but we know the money going to the investor for each scenario, so we can define the fair price for a bond for each scenario. So we can construct an upper and lower pricing bound for the money going to the investor in each case, where the lower pricing bound is just equivalent to the company reaching the target, so no additional penalty payment is paid. And the upper bound is the price when the company does not achieve the target and has to pay the additional penalty. So based on this upper and lower bound, we can then say if the price is larger than the upper bound, the bond is overpriced for sure. And if it's lower than the lower bound, it's underpriced for sure. So this leads us to conclude that for each single SLB issued at issue price B0, we can construct a mispricing measure called ML, which is basically the difference between the issuance price and the lower bound over the difference between the upper and the lower bound. We then can conclude that if ML is larger than 1, the SLB is overpriced, and if ML is smaller than 0, the SLB is underpriced. And for all ML falling between 0 and 1, we conclude that the bond should be fairly priced. If we now look at the empirical part, where we test the implications from our model in the data, we use around 300 SLBs to do that, and we use different data provider, for example, Bloomberg and Refinitiv, and some hand-collected data. For the SLB pricing, we look at bonds issued from December 2018 to February 2022. But I'm happy to say that we also now extended the data set to this year, and all major implications seem to hold also in the extended data set. So then for this set of bonds, we test our model implications. And then for the part with the real effects, we use a slightly larger sample to see if bond issuance also have real effects in companies reducing their greenhouse gas emissions. I'm going to skip this. So in the empirical part, as you remember, the first implication was that overpriced bonds should be underperforming in the secondary bond market. And this table should show us seems to be true. So when we look at the interaction of our mispricing level and the bond returns up to 20 trading days after the bond was issued, all the coefficients are basically negative and highly significant, indicating that overpriced bonds seem to underperform in the secondary bond market. So there we can already say, check, seems to be true. The second implication was related to the stock market, where we basically said that if the bond is overpriced, then we should see a positive stock market reaction due to this wealth transfer from bondholders to shareholders. So here we look at the CARs, or the cumulative abnormal returns for the issuing companies, up to 5 days after the bond was issued. And then we interact our mispricing level with the relative issue of each bond. We do this because we basically say that in order to significantly channel money into the shareholders' pockets, the issue size, so the issue amount over compared to the market value of the company, must be large enough. And again, we can see there seems to be a positive stock market reaction directly up to 5 days after the overpriced bond was issued. We also check if there was a pre-trend, and we find no evidence that for any pre-trend of this returns, and also no after effect. So this effect really is 5 days after the bonds were issued.
Leonie, sorry to interrupt. Can you wrap up in 1 minute?
Oh, okay. So one nice feature is also when we look at the real effects, namely, we wanted to see if issuing SLBs actually lead companies to reduce their greenhouse gas intensities. And this final table should show you that after issuing SLBs, companies' year-to-year changes in greenhouse gas emissions are basically negative and highly significant. So it seems that issuing SLB issuers really reduce their greenhouse gas intensity. So if I now need to conclude very quick, in our paper, we are the first ones to develop a conceptual framework to understand the pricing and the incentive structure of SLBs. We also find that if the penalty is large enough, that SLBs indeed incentivize managers to attain the KPIs, and then we use a model-free mispricing measure to see that or to prove that overpriced SLBs underperform in the secondary bond market, and we find some evidence for a wealth transfer from bond to stockholder. And finally, we can see that issuing SLBs has a significant real effect on the greenhouse gas intensities, namely that companies that issue SLBs, they decarbonize faster. Okay.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Leonie. Very good presentation. So yeah, sorry for the time constraint. I think your last result actually is pretty interesting. So too bad we don't have too much time to go through it, especially, when you talk about there's real impact, right, for the SLBs, because, those firms issuing SLBs decarbonize 6 to 7% points faster than the non-issuers. I think that really says, there's a huge positive, sustainability impact from the SLBs. So that's very nice results. So now let me come to the questions. While I'm waiting for the questions from the Q&As, I have one question from my side I just want to ask. It's about, the wealth transfer, right? So in your model, so the overpricing of the SLBs is because investors, though they are socially responsible, right? They derive a higher private benefits, the happiness from the environmental improvement. Therefore, they are willing to overpay. So, and such kind of overpayment, therefore will increase shareholders' value. So if that's the case, so if the value increase to shareholders derives from the bondholders' willingness to overpay because they derive their utilities from the environmental improvement, then shouldn't that be a win-win situation? I mean, why is a wealth transfer? But everybody's happy, right? The bondholder, they're happy to overpay, and the shareholders are happy to receive more money. So why is a wealth transfer?
Yeah, so I guess that's a very good and valid question. So basically what we say is there must be some responsible investors out there that are willing to overpay. So they know that they are overpaying, but these are most likely also the bond investors that don't sell off because they get this non-financial, non-monetary utility from holding such kind of instruments. But as we have seen on the bond market, there are actually some investors that only in there for the financial return. And once they notice that the bonds are overpriced, they sell off. So what we basically say is we cannot observe the fraction of investors that overpay due to preferences, but we assume that there still is sufficient amount of investors out there that are only investing into the bonds because maybe they bet on the penalty, or maybe they purchase these bonds because they want to make money.
Okay. So I'm seeing one question from the audience. It's let me go through. So yeah, it's about your empirical. So okay, let me sort the. Okay, so it's about what the policy recommendations you suggest from your theory, from your empiricals, to improve the design and efficiency of the SLB market.
Okay, so that's a very great question. I love hearing that because one problem with the SLBs is basically that some investors might bet on the company not achieving the target to get more money. And this is obviously some weirdness of the structure that I, as an investor, can also invest in a sustainable product, hoping I will get the penalty, so more money, if the company fails. And therefore, there are some SLBs out there where there's no coupon step up, but in order to pay the penalty directly to the investor, the company pays a penalty to a donation or a charitable organization, or has to invest additional money to purchase carbon set-offs. So in this kind of structure, the investor is not rewarded financially for the failure of the company, but the company still has to pay a penalty to a third party and, for example, purchase carbon set-offs. And we very much say that this is an ideal setting where the carbon reduction target would still be somehow or indirectly achieved by purchasing carbon set-offs. And actually, while extending the data right now, we also see that a lot of new SLBs that are issued adapt this type of penalty payment that goes to a third party rather than to the investor.
Okay, thank you very much. Very interesting paper, very good presentation. So thank you again. Also congratulations again for winning the award. And so next one, because of time constraint, I cannot take all the questions. So I'm going to move to the next presentation. Okay, so the next presentation will be done by Jacky Chen, Jacky Chen, and he is another runner-up winner of our student research competition. And Jacky is a PhD candidate in finance at the University of Oxford. and his research focuses on the corporate finance and the corporate governance. And today he's going to present, his winning paper titled "Public Policy and the Private Sector Proposal Motives: The Case of Greenhouse Gas Emissions." Okay, Jacky, it's all yours. So first of all, I think we have to change the Leonie, can you stop the sharing? And therefore we can let the Jacky to share.
I think I should already stop sharing, I guess.
Yeah, I think that you have to, yeah, okay, great. Jacky? Great.
Yeah.
Thank you,
Yeah,
please.
yeah, great. So thank you, Professor Yan, for introduction, and also many thanks to the committee for giving me this award. It's my great honor. Okay, so my paper is titled "Public Policy and Private Sector Pro-Social Motives: The Case of Greenhouse Gas Emissions." The previous studies have shown that private sector pro-social behavior is driven by various motives. These motives can be classified into two categories. The first category is policy incentives, like subsidies, taxes, and regulations. So for example, in the context of climate policies, some governments adopt subsidies for firms' green transitions, and also, for example, carbon taxes to discourage emissions. The other category is voluntary motives. For example, reputation and altruism. Many firms and investors want to be labeled as green investors and green firms. And also we know that some shareholders push their firms to cut emissions because of a genuine concern for the sustainability. And policymakers traditionally focus on the provision of policy incentives, like taxes and subsidies. However, little is known about how public policies affect private sector voluntary motives. And there's the research gap. And to analyze this interaction, I draw on existing theories on individuals, which suggest that public provision and extrinsic incentives can crowd out individuals' voluntary motives. However, it is unclear whether public policies can similarly crowd out private sector voluntary motives, and if so, what are the implications for corporate behavior? So in this paper, I ask such a question: how do public policies affect private sector pro-social motives and behavior? I specifically focus on greenhouse gas emissions reduction. The policy I focus on is adoption of emissions reduction targets adopted in 9 US states in 2019. I use a difference in differences for analysis by using firms in the 25 non-adopting states as the control group. I measure private sector voluntary motives by emission-related shareholder proposals. And I analyze private sector pro-social behavior by looking at the corporate emissions. These targets are not empty promises. They are supported by specific regulations and programs, like financial incentives, energy standards, and disclosure requirements, and they aim to reduce corporate emissions. Here is a preview of my results. I found that after the adoption of state-level targets, the likelihood of firms receiving emission-related shareholder proposals decreased by 37% of sample average. And the voting support rates on these proposals decreased by 40% of sample average. I find no evidence that state-level targets reduce corporate emissions. Overall, I find that public interventions may inadvertently crowd out private sector voluntary pro-social efforts and thereby undermine the intended policy outcomes. Now let me introduce more details. As I mentioned, there's no existing theories on the interaction between public policies and private sector pro-social motives. Therefore, I draw on the existing theories of individual motives to make predictions. First, climate policies entail subsidies, taxes, and upgraded industry standards, and so on. So therefore, public policies can directly provide policy incentives to reduce emissions. On the other hand, public policies can make it harder for outsiders to distinguish genuine sustainability commitments from policy-driven actions. And therefore, public policies can reduce reputational motives for being green investors and green firms. And in addition, public policies introduce regulatory pressure on firms to reduce emissions. And therefore, public policies can reduce investors' perceived need to engage with firms on climate issues. So therefore, on the one hand, public policies provide incentives for firms to cut emissions, but on the other, they can reduce voluntary motives to reduce emissions. So there are two important questions. First, whether the crowding out effect on voluntary motives does exist in the real world. And if so, what is the net policy effect of public policies on corporate emissions? To answer these questions, I use the following strategy. So I explore voluntary motives by looking at shareholder proposals, and I examine private sector behavior by looking at the emissions. I adopt a different diff model with two-way fixed effects. The dependent variable YIT is either proposal-based measures or emissions. The key explanatory variable adopted is the dummy equal to 1 if the state has adopted a target by the current year and 0 otherwise. I obtain proposals data from ISS database and emissions data from greenhouse gas emissions reporting program by EPA. And I use a panel data from 2016 to 2021, focusing on US firms. Now let's look at the results. So here, first, the policy impact on emission-related proposals. In columns 1 and 2, the dependent variable is a dummy, indicating whether a firm receives emission-related shareholder proposals in a given year. From these two columns, we can see after policy adoption, the likelihood of firms receiving emission-related shareholder proposals decreased by 0.8 percentage points. That is economically significant because the sample average is merely 2.1%. In columns 3 and 4, the dependent variable is a proportion of shareholder proposals that are related to emissions. And from the results, we can see that proportion also decreased by 5 percentage points, which accounts for around half of the sample average. And it's not only the likelihood of receiving emission-related proposals decrease, but also the supporting rate. So in this table, the dependent variable is the voting support for emission-related shareholder proposals. And we can see the support rate decrease by 12 percentage points after policy adoption, which accounts for more than 1/3 of sample average. And next, what is the policy impact on greenhouse gas emissions? In columns 1 and 2, the dependent variable is facility level emissions. And in columns 3 to 6, the dependent variable is state level greenhouse gas emissions. And the results are similar on both levels. I find a note we can see the coefficient is insignificantly positive, which means there's no evidence that these state level policies effectively reduce emissions. Okay. So to conclude, I explore the interaction between climate policy and private sector motives. And first, I find that climate policies might crowd out private sector voluntary motives to reduce emissions. And given this potential crowding out effect, whether climate policies can reduce emissions effectively depends on the balance between the direct policy impact, and the crowding out effect. And regarding the literature, there's a growing literature on how firms' commitments can influence climate policy making. And in this paper, I provide first evidence of the reverse interaction, namely how public policies can influence private sector's motives to reduce emissions. Although this paper focuses on greenhouse gas emissions and climate policies, it has a broader implication on public policy's effectiveness in general. It argues that public policies do not necessarily complement private sector pro-social efforts. Public policy making conventionally focuses on providing incentives like taxes and subsidies. And I argue that there might be unintended policy effects on private sector's voluntary motives. Okay, for the interest of time, I'm going to stop here and looking forward to your questions.
Okay, thank you, Jacky. So very clear presentation and good flow. Being the moderator, I think I have the privilege to first of all ask you some of my own questions. So I just trying to understand your test here. So when you have the empirical test, you have the treatment sample, which you have 9 states with the state target of emission levels in 2019. Do you have a control sample? Control sample, those are the 24 states which you don't have any.
Yeah, exactly. So
then how do you calculate adopted for the control sample? Because there's no adoption, right? So how do you calculate that?
Oh yeah, so there are actually 3 types of states. Some states adopt, there are 9 states that adopted a target in 2019 and used firms and facilities in these 9 states as a treatment group. And there are 25 states that have never adopted the target. And I use firms and facilities in these 25 states as a control group. And there are also some other states that adopted targets, but the adopting year are outside of my sample period, so I just throw them away.
So your adopted equal to 0 for all those 20-something states which have never adopted anything, right?
Yes, exactly.
Okay. So just 2 suggestions. First of all, I think you should not get rid of those 2 other states. I think you talk about 9 versus 11, and there are 2 states, I guess, in the adoption year in non-2019. I think you should include to have the staggered DID. The second of all, I think you should do the placebo test instead of treating adopted as 0 for those 25 states. You should have the placebo test, and that's going to make your results stronger. Okay, so that's just my
yes, thank you very much for yes, thank you very much for your suggestions. Very helpful. So regarding our first suggestion, I hope to include these states. However, they are outside of the available data or outside of the scope of the available data. So I just can't. I just don't have the data to analyze the other 11 states.
Okay.
And for your second suggestion, yes, I totally agree with you. And actually, because of the short lack of time, I don't have time to show that. But in my paper, I did examine the whether there's a change in proposals and emissions for the control states before and after 2019, and there are no results. So, yeah, I think that answers your second suggestion.
Yeah, that's good. So, yeah, and also typical kind of parallel kind of tests, I think you should also do. But anyway, so let me see, go to the questions. So let me see. Yeah, so what is again, that's the policy implication. What's the policy implication of the results? Does your results mean, does it mean that we should not have state regulations? Or I guess it's a state targeting the emission target, since it will crowd out the effort from the private sector. So I guess the question is that if there's crowd out effect, does that mean that we should not have any regulations?
Very good question. So I would say no, because as I mentioned, my paper suggests that there is might be a crowding out effect on private sector motives, and the net policy effect depends on the balance between the direct policy effect and the crowding out effect. And therefore, instead of suggesting no policies, I would argue that the policy implication is that if we want to adopt some policies, we should be aware of that there might be a crowding out effect. And therefore, if we really want to have policies, we need to make the policies strong enough or stringent enough to dominate the crowding out effect on private sector motives. So I'm not saying that whether we should have policies or not, or which type of policy we should have, but I hope to highlight that there is a crowding out effect that is often ignored or overlooked by researchers and regulators.
Okay, last question. I guess I just talk about my own question. I have another question. So I read your paper, very good paper, but your paper results are driven by the level of emissions, right? The long log emissions. And you also mentioned that if you logged the emissions, you're going to have different results. Not you, I mean, the literature will have different results. So my question is not about the log versus the long log. I'm just saying, why don't you also try the emission intensity, which people always use as well, right? Sometimes we care about the efficiency of, the production to reduce emissions. Right? Sometimes, because your result driven a lot by the size effect as well, you do have that results, the size effect results, the heterogeneity results based on the size. So therefore, size is a big factor. So why don't you use emission intensity, to study? Why do you use the level of emissions?
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much for your question. Yeah, so it's very good to suggest that definitely in the future, I will try intensity. So let me explain why for now I focus on emissions. That is because the targets, the policy targets of this, the target of these policies is about the level of emissions rather than emission intensity. So because I want to answer the question that whether these policies are effective, so I focused on the emission levels. And in addition, when I analyze these levels, in some specifications, I control for firm size and revenues and so on. So in some sense, I have considered the production scale. But as you suggested, later I should try how these policies affect emission intensity.
Great. Okay. I think time is up. So thank you very much for presentation. Again, congratulations for winning the award. So we are going to conclude the presentation. So I will pass the podium back to Henry, who will conclude our session today.
Thank you very much. So in closing, I'd like to add my note of congratulations to Huiyao, to Leonie, and to Jacky for winning the 5th annual research competition and the presentations that you made today. I also want to thank Srish and An for not only moderating these conversations, but also being outstanding partners over the last 5 years in making the research competition possible. And I'm hopeful, based on discussions that we've had to date, that we're going to continue and launch our 6th annual research competition. And for that, you'll have to stay tuned to a press release that we hope will be issued in the October 2025, October-November timeframe. Before I close, I just want to extend an invitation to anyone who is interested in attending FIAZI's annual meeting and cocktail party. It's scheduled to take place June 18th at the Harvard Club. You'll find more details on the FIAZI website. And you should also anticipate an announcement regarding our next Hall of Fame gala, as well as a potential event during Climate Week, which is scheduled to take place during the third week in September in New York City. So with that, I'd like to thank you all for attending and have a good rest of the evening.
Okay,
Thank you, Henry.
Thank you,
Thank
Henry,
you.
everyone. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank